Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Plyler with the Library of Congress, and I'm really excited about today's concert. We've got the Doric String Quartet playing a really magnificent program, which we'll talk a bit about. And I have two members of the quartet with me right now, Alex Reddington, violinist, and Hélène Clément, viola. So thanks both for being here, and we'll just kind of go ahead and get started.
Sure.
I always tend to start with the program because I think it's such a fascinating thing. Do you know how this program came together? Was there any connections that you were looking at, or was it more just, I know that you have a Haydn focus at times.
Sorry, that's a bit loud. We're always working on Haydn. We have an ongoing project to try to play them all and record them all. So at the moment, that is the Opus 64s, which we've been having the joy of playing for the last 18 months, 2 years. So obviously it makes sense to be doing them in our concert programs. And again, alongside that, the Beethoven 130 is a piece that we've been playing for many years, but we've had a long break from it, so we're coming back to it. And I think we're looking for a good balance to the program, because you don't want the Beethoven is so vast that we were looking for our first half to be made of pieces which have an emotional impact, but in a totally different way. So the Britain is a deeply personal and introspective piece, very different from the Beethoven, which is so kind of outgoing. So it has a great emotional impact, but in a totally different way.
Sure.
So that's why it works very well with this program.
Are you aware that we have the manuscript for the Haydn on display?
Yes, and some part of 130 as well.
Yeah, that's right. We have the Presto movement of 130. So those, you'll be able to check those out on display after the talk if you'd like. I believe this is the only full Haydn quartet that we have at the library. But it's kind of an interesting thing to take a look at, and it's kind of a neat thing to be able to hear these pieces. Next, one thing I think for... one of the things that I read about in one of the early reviews of the first published edition of this set of Haydn quartets, it remarked on how they were more technically feasible than what he had been known for before. But that struck me as, I'm not a string player, so I don't have that direct knowledge, but is it something that you'd say that there's any sort of let up in the technical requirements for it?
No.
I don't think so, actually.
You'll hear the last movement is a presto, and it's actually incredibly fast.
Yeah, it is, and the Lark quartet is the last movement is famously fast and fiddly. No, I wouldn't say, maybe on some levels, they're more approachable maybe than the Opus 76s, which would push the demands further, I think. But I wouldn't say they're any more approachable than the previous sets, the Opus 50s or 20s. I think that's they're looking, probably trying to sell them.
That's what I was wondering too.
Yeah.
What's been your experience? Are you doing when you do these works do you do them as a full set? Do you do them in groups of 3? I imagine that would probably be more likely.
Yeah, well, actually, we are in the very long process of trying to record as many of them as we can. So there are about 100 of them. So we need to be patient. Sure. But they all go by sets of 6, and we've been doing double CDs with the 6 of them each time. So far we've recorded the Opus 20s. And the Opus 76s, and we just recorded 64s.
Yeah, and it's quite rare to get the opportunity to play them all as a set. But we are this year at the Wigmore Hall. They're doing a celebration of not all of the Haydn quartets, but large numbers of the sets. So we did the Opus 20s back in September and November, so in 2 sets of 3 pieces per concert. And next week we will do that with the Opus 64s. So it's amazing to do them, to sort of survey them in that way.
It is so great, and somehow it's really exhausting. We've noticed, like when we come back off stage and it's just playing. It must be the same actually for every sort of cycle with every composer. It's just you immerse yourself in such a particular words that you don't have for the audience as well. You don't have the change of other pieces, or it's just a kind of, it gets very intense, and it's more exhausting than playing three different pieces
Yeah.
in a weird way.
But the Haydn of Opus 64, I'm sure, feels very different from the Haydn of Opus 20, I would imagine.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah.
We thank you. We were recently doing a talk somewhere I won't mention, but the person asking us question was saying, so how do you differentiate the Haydns? Aren't they all the same? We almost left without playing.
Oh, no. I'm glad I didn't.
Because actually, that's what we love about Haydn, that there are so many of them, yet we can't believe each time we start working on one that it's so surprising and it's so out there. Every one of them is a masterpiece. It's crazy.
Yeah, highly individual. Yeah, if you don't know all this literature, many of you know this literature inside and out, I think, because your string quartet fans have been coming for a long time. But yeah, they're just so individual, I think, and there's so much to find there. And he's also tends to be a surprising composer always. It's still today, I think. But yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, endlessly creative, yeah.
Skipping to Benjamin Britten, which I don't know if we have it out today, but we commissioned the first string quartet, and we have that manuscript here. We also have Peter Grimes and a few other things, but the distance between that work, which I think was 1941 or so, and the third quartet, which you're playing, which was finished in 75, I think, and first performed in 76, just after he died. It's kind of a big gulf of time there. I'm assuming you probably played all the Britten quartets at different points. What do you see any? How do you approach? I mean, obviously they're very different pieces from each other, but do you see the same composer approaching the string quartet in just different ways at the point he was at, or is it something where he's approaching it anew with each instance, or what's your response to it? I don't need to be that specific.
I mean, you can tell that there's, when we actually started, the first one we played was number 2, which we played a lot for many years, and then we played number 3 and then number 1. So we've kind of gone in a strange order with them. But I mean, there is it's what's startling about number 1 is, I believe he wrote it very quickly on the back of this commission, and it's just startling how unique and individual a voice he had with the quartet immediately. And I think that's something that you see through all 3 quartets. There's very particular textures, often very sparse. Mm-hmm. And with the 3 upper strings are sort of as a team, and the cello as a separate voice. And that happens a lot in the first and second quartet especially. But he sort of develops that idea in the third quartet, but he strips it down even further. So you've often got only 2 voices or 3 voices or something completely on its own. So it has this sort of, I don't know, sort of loneliness, doesn't it, as a work?
Yeah, I think it's the one piece especially in which he experimented the most with that sort of, it's the last piece he wrote, and he kind of in the last movement there's this chaconne that kind of gets going, and it's like he gets this sense of eternity. He doesn't. It's a quartet that's absolutely not trying to show off or to have something like the solo movement in the middle is incredibly calm, and it takes its time. It's something that needs patience, to play and to listen to, and it's very special for that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it, without doubt, it sort of evokes it for us very much the place where he was living and working, which is this very special area of the UK in Suffolk, and it's just remarkable, big skies and beautiful coastline and marshlands, and his music. Once you've been there, you can't help but sort of feel that very strongly.
You know
in his
where
music.
it comes from.
Yeah, there's something sort of magical or slightly otherworldly about that place, and that's in his music, and especially that's very poignant with this piece because he was composing it and he knew it was the very end of his life, and he even had a premonition that he wouldn't hear the premiere, which he didn't. So all of that adds to this very special feeling.
There's this element of introspection that I think you're touching on with this particular piece. There's no extroverted type of the types of thing that you might expect from and still get the kind of variety that you get in this piece. But there is this. I mean, literally prescribed operatic component to it. It's like the first movement being a duets, third one being solo, and then the use of the recitative in the finale to precede the Passacaglia. It seems like he's leading you down a certain path, in particular maybe to reference Death in Venice, his final opera, which he quotes in the recitative and then uses to build up that last piece. But there's also, I found it a little bit misleading when I was just listening to the piece, because the duets movement almost sounds like it's like almost like a unified voice, like the different pairs kind of have this composite feel to them, to me in some ways. And then the solo, while clearly the violin has that solo role, there's also this, it's supported in different ways that are so kind of hauntingly beautiful. I think that it's, I don't know, just to toss out a few thoughts.
I mean,
about it.
the titles are sort of misleadingly simplistic, and they are only just an idea of what he was going for. But I think it's interesting, that idea of it being going down the road of an operatic piece, and he was certainly, you know, looking back in order to look forwards, and he was very interested in Purcell and, you know, and Renaissance music, and there's a lot of that in these pieces, but all of his quartets as well.
Right, the second especially, right? And
with the chaconne.
And actually, as players, we noticed that it took us a few performances to get an idea of a global idea of the piece, because especially the first movement in the third quartet, it's if you play, it's quite tricky to play technically. But if you play, it's really hard to know what it sounds like. There's something that the textures he creates are so unused usually. They're so out there that it took us a few performances to be able to really see what the overall result is as a player.
Sure.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And of course, he knew string instruments well, so that was something that he was aware of. Probably, what he was asking, and I think he was able to work with. Was it the Amadeus Quartet, or he was able to work with them a little bit, to at least have a couple of rehearsals before he passed away. But
no, he definitely had a fantastic knowledge of string playing. I mean, his use of where to use open strings in chords and how to create textures and sound worlds is up there with all the great, like Bartok's quartets, or Beethoven. Even they really knew what they were writing for, and they knew if it was demanding as well.
In some weird way, the first movement of this reminds me of the first movement of the music for strings, percussion, and celesta, the Bartok. Just in terms, there's a certain arch to it that kind of comes through. But to make one last comment, that's maybe a stretch here, I found that Britain is able to do these with kind of minimal amounts of things to create such variety in his textures, especially with the types of duets and things that would happen. You also kind of see that happening in the Haydn, I think, just the way that he's using the quartet not just in the standard, way that one might expect from the quartet writing that he kind of helped to establish and whatnot, but in the Opus 64, the number 6 that you're playing, I think there's an element of just orchestration for the quartet that really comes through in both of those pieces.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And throughout the 64s, he's always playing with this idea of numbers of players. So the number 1, which we've been playing in the States on this tour, is also, I mean, it's the first of the set, but the first 8 bars are a string trio, and it's like a joke, really. Right. So he is, absolutely, and that's an amazing thing. You can see Haydn in everyone that came after. Every piece good piece that you play has learned something from that, from Haydn, no doubt.
Yeah, and I mean, this one is full of jokes and surprises as well. But the very beginning of it is in this really low, ambitious, it's very warm kind of tonality, and it's not at all like a beginning of a piece. Or even the beginning of the last movement is not like party time. It's like it's really unassuming somehow, really fun and unassuming.
Yeah. The whole first movement actually stays really quite like in the center of everybody's register. There's nothing, again, a little bit like the Britain, there's no sort of fireworks really, is there? It's very understated, and like you say, it's playing with just the simple ideas and the music material and seeing where he can take them. And but slowly, as the piece moves through, the second movement is very beautiful with an extremely dramatic surprising middle section.
Operatic,
Yeah,
actually.
again,
We have a
operatic.
theme of opera in
Yeah,
this
yeah.
concert.
But then it starts to
First
turn a
half.
corner, and the third and fourth, it just becomes more and more witty, doesn't it? And just full of fun. Yeah.
Well, jumping over to the Beethoven, which is kind of the monster piece in the program in terms of length, and I'm assuming everybody knows this piece pretty well. One question I always have for audiences with this particular piece is, how often do you hear it with the substituted finale versus hearing the grosse fuga? Has anybody heard a concert where it was using the originally published finale? No, so it's interesting. But do you ever do it with that finale, or do you prefer to always use the fugue?
Well, I think we learnt it. I mean, when we learnt it with the fugue. We haven't played the other movement. I think it was certainly I think it's now more traditional to play it with the fugue than it was 20 years, 30 years ago, maybe. We will learn the other movement and be really interested to perform it that way at some point. But at least at the moment, we so enjoy the kind of journey through the piece.
Sure.
And for us, the fugue makes such utter sense, doesn't it, as the culmination of this piece. Sort of almost feels like everything in some way is leading to that. And the contrast that you get, the cavatina is in a whole different light when you know what's coming after.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just to briefly, originally it had this large fugue. It's about 15 minutes long or so, as the finale, and then he was kind of talked into substituting it because of its lack of, potentially being detrimental to sales and things like that. And there's lots of conversation books and things like that show Beethoven talking through this whole process. He was very much aware and involved, and also involved in the types of edits that were happening with the proofs. He didn't actually get to see it. It was published after his death, but he said, well, okay, but I'm going to go ahead and publish it separately as Opus 133. And he also didn't like the forehand version that people had made for him, so he did his own. That ended up being his Opus 134 as a forehands version of the grosse fuga. Yeah. But in any case, it's still this. I'm glad that you're doing the fugue. So personally, so I think that's a great way to do it. I was just curious, but this the quartet itself has such a. It feels very different from the other late quartets in different ways, and I don't want to impose my thoughts on it. I'm just curious if you, having experience actually playing all these works that you know so well, what are some of the things that you find unique about this particular work?
Well, I think it's structurally so different because you've got these some very brief movements, which you don't find in the other late quartets. I mean, you've got the large structure of the first, which is a very traditional sonata form movement, and then then it sort of moves off into a more of a kind of suite idea, doesn't it? A little bit like the Britain, how it's more of a suite of movements, and I think it's much more an interplay on quick, sudden changes and contrasts. So the second almost acts as it's almost like a link somehow to the third. Mm-hmm. The way harmonically as well, the third comes out of the second, so it acts as almost like some sort of relief or release in some sort of way before you then get the next larger scale movement, which is again a very unusual character, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually every movement keeps its own character all the way through. Like every movement has a very strong specific idea and character, and they're all extremely different.
Yeah.
One from the other, as you were saying.
Absolutely, yeah, because a lot of the other late quartets have these huge variation movements, which you don't have in here, or the big Haile Gedenkgesang, kind of these expansive slow movements. So it's much more play on contrast. So you think from the third into the fourth, again, a shocking harmonic change, completely like if you've not heard the piece before, you're like, my God, how does this happen? How can we be in this key? And again, wacky characters, very strange. Almost simplistic, but he does enough with the detail to make it very strange. So there's not really a movement which is in any sense run-of-the-mill, is there?
No, there is no weaker or stronger movement.
Yeah.
And actually, what he does is that he writes, every movement is in a very specific form, so no movement is in the same form, and he explores the extremes. He goes beyond what anybody has done before. And actually, nobody after him will dare to do the same thing, which is insane because there were so many pieces after that. Well, and as a player, it's quite maybe it's the late quartet that is maybe the most uncomfortable to play, because it always has these extremes. Every bar has like some things that's not quite comfortable.
Yeah.
Well, part of it, I mean, just coming from a listener perspective, you mentioned these contrasts between movements, but even within the movements, like especially look at the first movement and the contrasting tempi that you have to have, right next to each other, and there's kind of just going back and forth, especially in the exposition and then towards the end.
Yeah.
I would imagine that it's hard just to kind of get that exact balance right, and I imagine it probably took quartets a while before they were doing that professionally comfortably.
Yeah, I mean, it remains a challenge every time you play it, this piece. Like, you never, with some other works you do at some point, after you play them 20 times or something, you can start to feel, I feel quite comfortable with this piece, but you just don't with this. It is just a very daunting prospect, partly technically, and for that reason you mentioned, that you never settle into one thing. In that, like the first movement, like you say, you're in an adagio, and then you're in an allegro, and the allegros are crazy, and the adagios are incredibly beautiful and expensive. So these contrasts are so difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
So it is remarkable. And then at the end of all of that, you still know you've got this monstrous piece to deal with.
I think I would give quite a lot of money to be able to be the string quartet that was the first one to open the music. Like how they must have felt. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I would imagine. I was just showing one of your colleagues before the Presto movement that we have, and one thing I hadn't had time to look at before, but just had a chance to look at, is that this strange moment, and this is only a 2.5 to 3 minute movement. It's not a giant piece, but there's this kind of a scale that happens in the violin, followed by these repeated Fs and G flats. It's just it feels a little bit out of nowhere, though it's reminiscent of stuff that happens like in the Hammerklavier Sonata and things like that. But I was thinking, I wonder how he notated those Fs and G flats. And it's super subtle, it's not the same kind of like giant strokes that I was kind of imagining them to be, because they're so, I think, invasive and exciting in performance. But it kind of goes against what you would expect Beethoven to have written, even though a lot of it is much more dramatic in the way that he's actually physically writing.
That's interesting.
Just
have to have a look. Yeah,
I
haven't
definitely
seen it yet.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
When you get to the last movement, well, I mean you have the two extremely lyrical movements that precede it, that are, I mean, I think just two gorgeous pieces that everybody loves. The Cavatina has a life of its own outside of just in the quartet context, through lots of transcriptions. Fritz Kreisler did a transcription of it for violin and piano. How do you transition and manage the complexity of the, this is an unfair question, I don't know how I would answer this ever, but how do you approach it, I guess, when a piece has so many multiple things going on at the same time after that slow overture? Is it just something that you just do it a chunk at a time and get it to the point where you feel absolutely in command of it, and then, or is it something where you just take the whole thing and go after it? And
we when you approach this piece that it's famous for being, chaotic and unlistenable and all the rest of things that people have said. We thought what we'd do is we'd just treat it like any other fugue, which it is. Each fugue which is in it is a traditional fugue, and actually very conventional in the length, in the structure of it and the harmonies that it goes through. So we thought we would take out the elements which make it crazy, like the constant fortissimos, the constant sforzandos, take out the rhythm, and so we just played really the harmony. And we tried to work out a really clear harmonic structure when we were in transition periods, and tried to find climaxes within. So we tried to find more than one fortissimo. We tried, which there still has to be a musical sense to this. It's still music. So we treated it like we would a Bach fugue, and we shaped it in the same way.
Yeah, we've like harmonic tensions and releases, basically. Yeah. And the releases very often meet up as a group. They're quite important kind of tutti fill. And if you really acknowledge that, you find ways to make transitions and more approachable.
Yeah. So we to start off with, we exaggerated it all. So we didn't play it all fortissimo. We played it as though that wasn't there. So with lots of shape. And then we introduced the other things but then we had a much stronger idea of what character we were looking for in each moment. So we weren't just going for this kind of relentless
Sure.
feel. We were trying to make and balancing it, so you can hear the voices, because it's so dangerous that it just becomes a mess. And you would never do that with a Bach or Haydn fugue. So I don't see why it has to be that way with this fugue, which sometimes it can be, I think.
That's a great answer, and especially when you have those other the kind of developmental passages that are very like march-like, or things like that that can be quite a contrast to provide between the fugues and things like that.
Absolutely, there is some very light-hearted music in
Yeah,
there as an offset again, going with character with the rest of the piece, going for these extreme contrasts.
Extreme. And that's something I think as a group that we try as much as we can to do when we approach a piece, is to see what is in the score in order to create emotions, and not to start with emotions and then try to make it work, like to really see what's there at the roots.
That seems very wise, to not, and just to also abandon maybe some of the historical baggage or something that comes with it, especially
Absolutely.
with a piece that's still, well, not really, it's controversial now, but had such a controversial history.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Before we open up to a few questions from people, if they have it, maybe you can tell us about some of your current projects that you're up to, the recording projects, or tours, or anything else that you'd like to tell us, or what kind of repertoire are you playing?
Well, actually, the Britain, we have in the fall we are going to record the Free Britain in Snape Hall, so where it all happens. So that's a very special project for us.
Yeah, it's quite a meaningful place. Suffolk is the county I grew up in, and I had all my violin lessons about 5 miles away from there. And also, it's where the quartet formed, because there's a music school in the area called Pro Cordo, which I started to go to when I was 9, and our cellist, John, went there as well as a child. So we've known each other through that place since then, since the age of 9, 10 years old. So it's quite a meaningful area. So to go there to record it in the hall where the Third Quartet was premiered and where he lived and worked makes it a really special project.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And next week we do the cycle of 64s, which goes with the release of our CD at the Wigmore Hall in London. So that will be this kind of intense concert I was talking about, with three of them in one concert, and then a week later, right? Yeah. The 3 others.
Are you doing 1, 2, 3, and 3, 4, or 4, 5, 6?
Yeah, because
exactly.
Why not?
Well, I'd read somewhere, just as an aside, that he'd originally had the E flat and the D were reversed.
Yeah, I've read that. Yeah.
With a particular dramatic kind of intent, maybe in mind for that. But
that's really interesting. I think it's probably our decision, but partly the hall as well. I think they like to have them in the sort of chronological order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anybody have any questions that they'd like to throw out there? If you do, we have a microphone that'll come just so we can catch your questions. Surely somebody has a question.
We've said it all.
Oh, here's one. Just one moment, we'll give you
Thanks. So I'm not so much of a student of all the music that goes on here in the series at the library, but your focus on Haydn. I understand your intention to record everything, but what does Haydn as a composer in the bigger context of music mean to you as musicians? What energizes you about Haydn, or for that matter, how should it energize us as the audience?
Well, actually, we feel extremely. Yeah, he is probably the composer that we feel the most special related to, and his creativity is probably what keeps. Mind blowing us.
Absolutely, it's like I was saying, there's so many of them that you can't. I mean, we don't know them all, but we sit through. We're going to do a new set. We'll sit through and read them, and we just can't believe what's going on.
Gasping
we can't believe that he's doing the things that he's doing, and it is sort of genuinely a really exciting moment when we sit and read one that we don't know, and you get this sort of thrill and the joy of those early rehearsals, because with Haydn there is so much left to you to make decisions for yourself as a group, because the scores are quite sparse. Not like Beethoven or composers came later, where there's so much detail written in. There's very little detail. The earlier you go in the sets, the less detail. So you have to. It's a great opportunity as for the players to try and find what he wants to really bring it to life for the audience.
Yeah, and actually he's been probably the one composer that has been made the least justice, because he's been played so many times in lifts, and you go have a nice brunch and there is some nice Haydn quartet playing somewhere, and it's lovely, but actually there's so much harmonic drama in his music that's something we feel we as performers, we need to make justice to that, to really translate that.
There's been much greater performer advocacy, I'd say, in the last 50 years than there was a long time ago in terms of these works getting performed. And one thing, just looking at that came to mind is Britten actually loved Haydn as well, and he would sometimes, before going to sleep at night, he would sit there with some Haydn quartets and just read them in his bed. But Britten thought of him as a composer's composer, as opposed to, but maybe that was because there wasn't as much of that advocacy from, great quartets playing his music. So it's kind of exciting to see this resurgence. And
yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of composers, certainly Beethoven and Mozart saw him as the great composer. And I think it might be another one, but I believe, might be wrong, but Beethoven wrote at the end of the Cavatina, but Haydn could have done it better.
Oh.
I think it's the Cavatina. It might be one of the other ones. But
maybe.
They had huge respect for him.
Another question?
When you practice, you read a piece, you practice a piece, and you get command of a piece, and at that point, do you ever find it evolving so that, you're surprised by how it evolves as you play it? And do you find yourself thinking back at the first time you played a particular piece in a performance and think, gee, we play it completely differently now?
Yes, certainly. And even when you listen back to a recording you made 2 years ago, you're like, oh my God,
that's
wish we
why
could do that
never
again.
listen back.
This is a good idea. Yeah, the very first process of learning a piece before you perform it for the first time is the very earliest stages. And I really feel like you don't really know a piece until you've played it in public quite a few times, to be honest. Pieces feel so different in different circumstances, different halls, and they grow so much from being performed. You don't really feel like you own it until you've really performed it a lot, really, do you?
Yeah, that's for sure. And actually, being four is a blessing as well, because we all have different experiences in our lives as well. While it happens, we all go through different emotional processes, and that make us think of music, feel music differently. So it keeps the group itself, the quartet itself, keeps growing all the time, and the pieces obviously change drastically. And
it's evolved. No, no. But we've got we have a very solid working process. Like we never shut anyone down. If someone has a thought like I'd love to try it differently, we'll never just say, oh no, we've been doing it like this for so long, we couldn't possibly change it. We're always open to people's thoughts, and we'll always give it a try.
And actually, if you play in a string quartet, you have to, because basically you spend many more hours of your life rehearsing than playing. So if you don't enjoy the rehearsing process, you just you waste your life.
Absolutely, yeah.
A couple more questions.
Not so much a question as a comment. David, you mentioned Britten's admiration of Haydn, and I guess that he liked to listen to the music. Apparently Stravinsky in his final days, when he was bedridden, the music he was listening to the most were the Beethoven late quartets. I assume the Grosse Fuge was in there too, so I just thought I'd add that comment.
Oh,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Oh,
I mean, people said that the Grosse Fuge is the start of modern music, which is absolutely is.
It's with a little bit of trepidation I ask a question for fear that you might flee the stage before you play, but I'll take the risk. I'm curious to know what criteria you use in selecting which Haydn pieces to record. I mean, obviously, you've chosen not to do it chronologically, and I'm assuming it's not random. So, what are the criteria?
To start with, I think we were interested in what we feel are his most, outlandish sets. Really, the ones which really set him apart, and when he really started to own the genre. So that's why we did the Opus 20s first, because we felt that was really when he took on. Obviously, he was key in inventing the genre of string quartet, but also the 20s are when he really took hold of it and really started to let his creative mind out. So that's why we selected to do those first.
And then 76s are drastically different because they happened much later in his life, and he explored then the orchestral side of it, much more symphonic kind of. But and now I think it's also quite relaxed, right? We don't have a set plan. We decide 3-4 years in advance which set we would like to start, and it's just open discussions really, which is quite fun.
It is. I mean, so the 20s and 76s were very sort of intentional, but from now 64s, I think we were programmed to play one or two of them, and we thought, well, this is the next set. This is what we want to do, because it's just so fascinating. So I think we're on to Opus 33s next. Yeah. So it's a little bit random from now on, actually. But the amazing thing about it is, that's the wonderful thing about it, is that there's not a dud piece in 83. I can't remember exactly how many he wrote. But
there's no wrong choice to make.
There is just no wrong choice. You're going to have a great time learning and recording them. So, yeah, thanks.
But we are lucky enough that we have a great contract with our recording company, so we can record 1 or 2 CDs a year. So alongside the Haydns, we just recorded 3 Mendelssohn quartets, and we've done Janacek, Schubert G major. So it's not like we're yeah.
You did the Korngolds as well, right? We have a number of those pieces here at the library.
I think we played the 3rd quartet when we were here last in 2010, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think we should let our musicians go and just have a chance to get ready for the concert. But please join me in thanking them for being here and speaking with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.